Thank you for coming. My name is Brendan Coyle with High West Distillery. I'm the lead distiller and production manager for High West. I'm the technical guy for the business. You have your sales guys and your brand managers, and I'm the tech guy. So what I bring to the table tonight is a little bit of science. It'll be fun, I promise. We're tasting whiskey. We're talking about what goes into a great whiskey, what goes into a great blend, and really how the science interacts with that to make the beverage that we all love and are here for. So art or science, what is it? It has to be both. Absolutely has to be both, because everything we do in the distilling industry has a scientific backbone to it, a reason, an explanation for what it is that we're doing. Mastering a great whiskey, it's as much as a chemistry assignment as it is an art project, and that's just the way it is. So going forward, a quick background on whiskey. I don't know the level of understanding of everybody in the classroom here, so I'm just going to go through real quick and go over the process of making whiskey, and then go into the 5 components that make a great whiskey great and the science behind those components. So really what we're talking about whiskey here is a beer. Whiskey is a fermented beverage from grain, which is exactly what a beer is. Now there's 2 big differences. Number 1, we don't use hops traditionally in American whiskey. There's a segment of the industry that's rising right now that is flavored hopped whiskeys. It's a very, very, very small segment, very, very experimental right now. But traditionally, we don't use hops in the whiskey that we drink. And number 2, in the process in America, we typically do not filter the grains out. We leave the grains in the process all the way through till the end, through to distillation. And I'll explain why we use that grain and what we're getting from that grain here in just a second. Scotch malt whiskeys, they typically filter the grain out. It's a common process in Scotland for single malts and things like that. With the grains that we're using in America, it's much harder to filter them out, so we leave them in through the entire process. But other than that, it's just a beer. There's nothing different about it. So you have many components, and I'm going to go through just a quick 4 steps fast here on milling the grain. You have a bunch of grain that you bring into the process, and we need flavor, aroma, and starches and sugars from those grains. So the first part is milling the grain. We have to crack open that grain and access the starch that we're going to then turn into sugars. Starch is just like any other kind of baker's flour you'd use to make pancakes or bread or whatever it might be. Starch is milled up grains. So in America, we hammer mill that grain into a coarse flour just like you would a baker would use. And we then move on in the process to mashing. Now, mashing is the stage of the game where we're taking those starches out of the grain and we're converting them into simple sugars. So I'm going to jump ahead to this real quick. This is a basic, simple starch. You have individual sugar compounds that are linked in a chain, and what enzymes do is we break down all of these individual sugars, and we break down these starch linkages into individual sugars. Sugars is what the yeast needs. It's its food source. We're eventually going to get to ethanol through those sugars, but the first thing is the yeast has to eat. It's the same thing in the brewing process. So we take these long starch molecules, we break. Once we have our starches broken up into individual sugars, we can continue on in the process. Here's basic fermentation. I don't want to get too geeked out in chemistry tonight. It's been a long day of good, healthy drinking. But what we have is we have our individual sugars. We have yeast absorb those sugars, get the energy out of the sugars that they need to go forward, and then they emit 2 different products. Ethanol, what we know and love and are drinking here today, and CO2. CO2 is emitted out of the process. It basically spills out of the fermenter and onto the floor. We don't really need that. Some distilleries will harvest it, but it's not necessary. So now that we have our ethanol in solution, we proceed through fermentation. Now, I think we all know about the barrel's influence on whiskey and what the barrel can do. It's a wonderful form that we have to work with for whiskey. Now, what happens before that barrel? We have a lot of things going on that goes into a fresh new made whiskey, and I'm going to tell you right now, the barrel is really the easiest part, to be quite honest. It's the longest part, takes the most amount of time, but it's the easiest part. It's the mashing and the fermentation and the real science behind it. That's the hard part. So, the 5 things about important things about fresh whiskey. We have, number 1, the grain. We all talk about the grain bill. Distillers love to talk about the grain bill. They glamorize it and they say, you know, this is 85% corn, this is 20% malted barley, and there's all these different formulas for what makes whiskeys really good. The grain does have a big influence both on the process and on the flavors and aromas. The mashing and fermentation style
I'll get into this in a second. There's several different ways we can mash and ferment in the business. I touched on it real briefly about the difference between American whiskeys and Scotch whiskeys. We have the yeast, and that is your single most important component. Fresh whiskey, fresh off the still. So I mashed the beer, I fermented the beer, and then I ran it through the distillation. And I boiled the beer and pulled off all your aromatic whiskey components, the ethanol and flavor. So that's in your fresh whiskey. You take that fresh whiskey that goes into the barrel, and that basically stays for 2, 5, 10, 20 plus years. Fresh as before barrel. Yeah, the way that I'm going to use it is like fresh as before barrel. Yeah. Sorry, I should clarify that. So we have the yeast influence on the whiskey, and the yeast is obviously making our ethanol. It's very, very important, but it's also doing a lot of other things, and that's making flavor and aroma compounds. It's making things like esters and acids, and there's a whole bunch of different range of these classic compounds. But they have fruity flavors and aromas, and they have, sour flavors and aromas, and things like that, that in low concentration give the whiskey a more rounded character, essentially. And then we have the distillation style. There's different ways to distill in this industry. I'm going to touch on 2 different styles tonight, straight and light. When you're talking about a pot distiller, you can either distill the low spectrum or the high spectrum. So we add yeast into the process. There is yeast naturally on the outside of the grain. I'm going to get into that just a little bit here when we talk about bacteria and things like that. But we dose the yeast that we want in there because we know specific yeast strains give us specific flavors and aromas, and we're going to go after that. So we're going to put in there what we like. So number 1, the grain. We're a big rye whiskey producer. High West, we love rye whiskey, so we focus on the spiciness of the rye. It's got a lot of great compounds to it. It gives off a lot of spicy clove and rosemary, pepper and things up in the mash, in the fermentation. It's really, really truthful. When you choose grains for a whiskey, you're going to focus on those grains that are going to give you the character you want in the end. Rye is a great example. Malted barley has been in the process for a long time because malted barley was necessary for enzymes. If you go back to that starch chain, remember the starch chain we're breaking off the simple sugars? Enzymes are what do that for us. They take that long starch chain and they cleave off those simple sugars over and over and over again. Enzymes are just proteins, is all they are. And they do the job for us. Malted barley is really important because malted barley has lots of those enzymes. So historically, you see malted barley in the process throughout all these different types of whiskeys because it was really helpful in the process. It gave us what we needed. It gave us the individual sugars that it used to need. Nowadays, we can make enzymes. We don't necessarily need malted barley anymore, but you still see it used a lot because it's got great flavor and aroma to it. Once again, you can still utilize those enzymes and just help us out. You don't have to use as many enzymes. Number 2 is the mash and fermentation style. I mentioned real briefly earlier on filtering the grain out versus leaving the grain in. Scotch malt whiskeys, a lot of Scotch malt whiskeys, they filter the grain out, meaning they'll go through that mashing stage, they'll get everything they need from the grain, and then they'll filter that grain out. It's no longer in the process. And then we move forward to fermentation and distillation as usual. In American whiskeys, traditionally, we use things like corn, we use things like oats, we use things like rye. We use grains that are very, very difficult to filter out. And because of that, it's easier in the process to hammer mill these grains up into a coarse flour and just leave it in the process all the way through. It has a lot of different implications on flavor and aroma, but that's how it was even done in the past because we really couldn't filter those grains out very well. There's a lot of differences between those grains and malted barley. So grain in whiskeys, this is a Buffalo Trace Distillery, I believe, and you can see that slurry. It's basically just water and flour combined. It's a corn mash, it's bourbon mash. It's being pumped into one of the fermenters. It's basically kind of like a very, very thin oatmeal slurry of sorts. And this will have flavor and aroma results in the end. Grain out whiskeys, like you see in Scotland, this is Embredauer, I believe. And what they do is they go into a mash tun with their water and their milled grain. And this milled grain is not milled like a flour. It's actually very, very coarse. If you held that in your hand, it would almost look like whole grain. It's so coarse. And they mash that into a mash tun. They mix it all up, and the mash happens and everything. And then they filter it all out. What he's doing right now is he's adding, a a second or a third water addition to rinse that grain. While you filter the grain out, you rinse the grain out to get all the sugars that you can out. And so from then on, it goes on to be cattle feed or something. They have dried grains that they produce for the cattle industry and the hog industry, much like that. And your sweet liquid, the sweet sugary liquid that comes off those grains, goes forward in the process. So what's the difference? It's a very complex topic. You have lots of things going on, so I'm just going to touch on the two big ones. First of all, yeast ferments differently in two different types of environments. If you have all that grain in your fermentation versus all that grain out of your fermentation, the yeast will ferment in some different ways. It'll produce different flavors and aromas. It's pretty complicated if not, so I'm not going to get into that. However, just keep in mind that the yeast will behave differently in the two different types of fermentations. Also, you have different flavors and aromas that come over in the distillation. When you put it through the fermentation and the distillation, you essentially cook these grains for a long period of time. The distillation can last 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 plus hours. So that entire time that you're in that distillation, you're cooking that grain. So think of like that smell of fresh cooked oatmeal coming off the stove. You get a lot of those cooked cereal flavors and aromas in the final product. Complexity is really what happens when you cook in that grain in the process. The yeast. Earlier I was mentioning, you hear all these distillers talk about the grain bill, how wonderful it is to have this and that inside the grain bill, and it offers all these great complexities. But the number one thing that distillers have to tweak with that makes the biggest impact is the yeast. And the reason why you never hear about it is because distillers don't want to talk about it. It's a very, very important organism, and the range of flavors that you can get from yeast are immense, absolutely immense. I listed some of these here because these are some of the esters that I deal with on a daily basis in my process. I have 3 different yeast strains in my process at High West, and they're all making very, very different whiskeys. In fact, right now, we focus on 3 different rye whiskeys, and that's the only difference. It's just the yeast, nothing else. And they're wildly, wildly different rye whiskeys. These, I mentioned esters earlier, and these are a class of esters. When you have an alcohol and an acid get together, you form an ester. No, the yeast produces those flavors and aromas. It gives off those flavors and aromas. So I'm not actually using them in the process. It just smells like I am. If you smell that fermentation, it smells like strawberries, or it smells kind of like bananas. So that just happens. It comes through the process naturally. It's a natural process of yeast. And as I said, it can be wildly, wildly different. These are just a few of the examples. And as I just mentioned, yeast is the biggest guarded tool amongst distillers. Distillers will track the yeast performance and make very key decisions about the distillery and how the process is going. We're not tracking the actual growth of yeast so much, we're tracking what it produces. So back to strawberries and banana, those are esters, and you can actually measure those in the process. We have machines that can measure these strawberry esters, these banana esters, and you can see spikes, and you can see trends over time. So if we're looking at these graphs and we see a rise and a rise and a rise and a rise in a certain ester, it can kind of tip us off and say, well, we typically don't see that kind of a rise, so we'll go back and we'll check our yeast strain and make sure nothing's all messed up. So you're tracking what the yeast is producing, not the yeast itself. It's a really good way to monitor the process, and we all do it in the industry.
So typically you have a single strain for fermentation, there's a lot of strains.
You have a single strain that you put in fermentation. When you combine these strains in fermentation, usually one wins. Just like the back alley, somebody wins because one's going to be a little bit more aggressive. It's very, very hard to manage that, so it's much easier to just keep them single yeast fermentations. And then we'll do our blending later on. It's very, very similar, yes. It's basically the same type of yeast, just different species, essentially. But yeah, same type situation. I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because a baker, for example, will not pick those yeast strains so much for flavors and aromas, but for a certain gas production. So you'll have, sourdough and things like that. You want a certain sourness in there. They pick the yeast strains for different reasons than a distiller or a brewer. So yeast can be a very, very aggressive flavor and aroma in distillation. So what you typically do is you look for balance. You want as much grain character as yeast character, usually. Now, there's different spirits we make for blending. That's why I put this up here. Sometimes you want to just blow out that whiskey and have a very, very predominant ester in that whiskey, like for example, plums. I have a yeast strain that I mess with that has a very, very, very predominant red plum flavor and aroma. It doesn't let the grain shine through so much. It's kind of dominant on that plum ester side. But I like that because I'm looking towards that yeast to be a good blending agent later on. So that's one of the examples of how we can change things for our blends down the road. Now, like we have yeast, we have bacteria. And bacteria, we all know the bad things about bacteria. There's actually some really, really good things about bacteria as well. We don't necessarily put bacteria in the fermentation, but it's there naturally. It comes in on the grain, just like other yeast strains do. You have this bacteria that comes in, and you want some bacterial growth, but you don't want too much. It's a very, very important thing to control. We get very different flavors and aromas from the bacteria, just like the yeast. Bacteria usually goes down that sour and sweet kind of realm, so you don't want your mash to be too sour, so that's why you control it. In certain mashes, you will cook the grains, and in certain mashes, you will not cook the grains. So for example, if I cook the grains, I'm maybe close to boiling them, 200 degrees Fahrenheit perhaps. And that will sterilize the mash. It will kill all that bacteria and all that yeast on the outside of the grain. If I mash at a lower temperature, like 145 or less, then I'm not sterilizing the mash. I'm keeping all those microbes in there. So then I have to be careful it doesn't get too out of hand. So it's all about your microbe balance. You're always going to have the bacteria starting at the beginning of fermentation and going right through to the end, and it keeps on going after fermentation stops. So the real tricky part is controlling it. Distillation style, the fifth major way to control our flavors and aromas, is very, very important. We have two realms in America. We have straight whiskeys and we have light whiskeys. And when we distill something, it comes off the still at a higher alcohol by volume than what you're actually going to drink. It always comes off that way, and you have basically a fermentation, or excuse me, a distillation curve. How it comes off the still at such and such a proof, and then as time goes on, that curve will come, top out, and then drop off on the backside and get lower and lower in proof. We're dealing with one batch of beer, so as we take more ethanol out of the batch, as we distill more ethanol out of the batch, then the batch changes. So you're going to get less and less and less out of the end. And because of this, you have to be very careful about what type of whiskey we're making. So all the bourbons and the ryes that you enjoy drinking in the United States, they're mostly straight whiskeys. You're basically drinking straight whiskey. Everyone knows how proof works. Proof is twice the alcohol content by volume. Okay? Well, straight whiskeys come off the still less than 160 proof. As you lower the proof, and the proof comes off lower, you have more flavor and aroma. As you raise the proof, you distill it at a higher proof, you have less flavor and aroma. It'll work inversely. So light whiskey, and we have an example of light whiskey in front of you. It is on your front left, that's the clear whiskey. This is the light whiskey called the Silver Oak. Jump ahead real quick to Silver Oak operates with this distillation curve. So as you can see, when we top out, we're at 180 proof on that distillation. And that's very, very important because it's subtlety in the flavors. Light whiskeys are very, very subtle. With balance and subtleties. And so for almost the entire distillation, you run this very, very high proof and a nice subtle, pleasant flavor aroma that's coming over. So let's get into it and nose it just real quick here for a second. This yeast strain that we use to make this whiskey has lots of these tropical fruits, flavors, and aromas. Now, it's not going to be in your face like fruit juice, but it's going to have very subtle tropical flavors and aromas, and some banana as well you'll probably pick up there. That's directly from the yeast. The yeast produces those flavors in the process. You're going to notice a little bit of some slight vanilla in there as well, and a great, great rich body and mouthfeel when you get it on your tongue. So go ahead and taste it. You have fairly viscous mouthfeel to it. And there's lots and lots of popping fruits and flavors. So that's fresh whiskey right off the still. traditionally it's just grain and it's just yeast. That's correct, yeah. The question was, are there any other ingredients that go in that process, any major ingredients? It's all the different types of grains you use, and you'll usually have anywhere from 2 to as many as 5 or 6 or more grains in that fermentation. But besides the grains and the yeast, those are the major ingredients that give you all those nice flavors and aromas. So, with this distillation curve that we're looking at, we have cut points. Is anyone familiar with cut points? I've heard what a cut point is in the batch distillation. We don't distill off the entire batch. We distill it off in 3 sections. Because, as I mentioned earlier, it changes throughout the entire distillation. So in a batch distillation, you have your heads, you have your spirit, and you have your tails. This is that great middle cut section that we're looking for. That's the spirit that has all the wonderful flavors and aromas that we're looking to bottle or barrel. The time lasts anywhere from 5 to 7, maybe 8 hours in batch distillation. And so you start with the heads. The heads is very, very short. It's the smallest cut of the 3. So in the heads, you have your highest volatility compounds. By highest volatility, I mean it's the stuff that comes over in the distillation at the lowest temperature. So you have things like methanol, which is really just race car fuel. That's what it is, and that's one of the reasons why we cut the heads out of the process. You can't drink methanol; it's bad for you. You have acetone, which is essentially nail polish. It's the same similar compound. It smells just like nail polish. The acetaldehyde, tart green apple skins, it's kind of a negative tart green apple skin. It's overly tart and overly green, essentially. So we tend to cut that out as well. These are all very, very light compounds. So they come over usually in the first 15 to 25 minutes, so pretty quick. And then you have the spirit, the goods, mostly ethanol, similar volatility to compounds. So back to the esters that we were creating in the fermentation process. Those esters were created in that same range of ethanol. So they'll come over with the rest of the ethanol in the process. Right there I have ethyl esters. Ethanol is an alcohol, and acid is acid. You have all different types of acids, you have all different types of alcohols in these batches. When you take an alcohol and you put it together with an acid, you have an ester. That's what forms these fruity flavors and aromas. And then we come to our tails. The tails would be the second biggest chunk, the spirit being the biggest. The tails, we don't necessarily want to get rid of the tails. There's nothing dangerous in the tails to us. But the flavor and the aroma is slightly different, and we don't necessarily like it in our spirit cup. The key thing about the tails is there's still lots of ethanol in it. So you need to hold on to those tails, you need to recycle the tails. If you pour all that ethanol down the drain every batch, it would be very, very wasteful and a pretty expensive batch whiskey. So what we end up doing is we recycle that tails cut back into every distillation. So you cut that out in one distillation, it gets recycled into the next, and so forth and so on. It's in a constant state of circulation. You never waste it, it never really goes down the drain, but you never really gain it either. It's just in that constant state of recycling. So it's there to make the spirit cup look bigger. It's there to make it look better and make it shine. So where do we make these cuts? It's really up to any distiller where you make those cuts. That's the very, very artistic and personal thing about this industry. So typically, when a distillery goes into operation, it develops these cut points, and it's all based off the nose. It's based off flavor, aroma, and nose. It's all about what you smell and what you taste in your whiskey. Then when you make those cut points, you stick with them, and they never really change for that product for the life of the brand. Changing those cut points will very much change the ending of whiskey out of the barrel. So, if you want a nice big full flavor product, you go for very broad cuts. You have a very, very wide spirit cut. You cut to spirit early, and you cut away from spirit late. That gives you a very, very full body, full flavor whiskey. If you do narrow cuts, then you have a very, very light and flavorful whiskey, but it's not very heavy on the palate. For every product that I do, I have different cuts, and we always stick to them. So these are our 2 silver whiskeys. These are our unaged whiskeys. We're aging these whiskeys as well, and we're going to taste not some of these whiskeys aged up. We're going to taste some of our blends here as we get to some of the other rye whiskeys. Now these silver whiskeys, they're very fermentation forward, so they're typically very fruity whiskeys. The silver whiskey that we just tasted Does anyone like it? It's a big, intense, straight whiskey. I mean, there's a lot going on in that whiskey. So that's actually a blend of 3 different yeast strains in that whiskey. And it'll go through an age over the course of several years, and then we'll then blend those yeast strains at different concentrations after they're out of the barrel. So aging spirits. How long do we age them for? And really, it's just after what you want in the spirit. Are you looking for a heavy, rich, or a light spirit-forward product? Some of the whiskeys that we're going to try here, you're going to taste some very, very young and some very, very old. What we like to do is do interesting blends between the young ones and the old ones. And the reason why you do that is you focus on very, very different flavor profiles between these whiskeys. If you blend them at just the right concentration, you can really harmonize those flavors really, really well. So, blending whiskey. Creating a great blend is all about using the differences in your favor. So let's go to number 2 glass in front of you. That's in front of you and on your right. Left to right. Yeah, left to right, yep. On your right. The first age whiskey in front of you. This is a whiskey called Double Rye. This is a blend of 2 straights, a 2-year-old whiskey and a 16-year-old whiskey. They're both straight ryes. And the purpose of this product is to focus on the 2-year-old whiskey. A lot of people say, well, why would you focus on the 2-year-old whiskey? It's a young whiskey. We like old whiskeys. Older isn't always better, it's just different. You have some very, very interesting flavors and aromas that come out young in the age of the whiskey, and they can go away later on in the maturation period. The flip side of that is young whiskey tends to be a little bit on the aggressive side. It tends to be a little bit hot. So we bring in that 16-year-old whiskey, smoothing it out. It basically fills in the gaps, rounds out the flavor. We can still focus on the nice spice of that red whiskey. We can also have a little bit of richness as well from that 16-year-old whiskey. So really what you're achieving is this. What's that? We're looking for complexity and we're looking for balance. Occasionally you will have barrels that come out of the warehouse, and they are just the most wonderful things, and sliced bread, it's amazing. They have all these wonderful components that you look for in great whiskey. But to be quite honest, they are few and far between. They call those honey barrels in the American whiskey industry. And when you have honey barrels come through, everyone takes notice because it's a really, really nice thing to see come through. But the reality of it is you don't get that all the time. So what you do is you create these different blending products to create a wonderfully balanced and complex whiskey. Yeah?
Honey barrels are named market.
Well, they'll either go on to be a straight single barrel, or they'll go into a blend because they have some kind of component that they want to use in the blend. So quite often you'll see these single barrels come through, and they're usually similar to those honey barrels, so to speak. They happen to have that right balance, that right complexity that you look for in a single barrel. But a lot more rare than the one-sided. Okay, so let's go to glass number 3 in line. That's next in line on your left, away from you. This is the Rendezvous Rye. This is the first whiskey we came out with. It's a blend of a 6-year-old and a 16-year-old whiskey. So we've taken that gap between 2 years and 16 years, and we've now brought that gap smaller. What we're looking for in this whiskey, we're not so much focusing on that intense young spice of the grain anymore. We're looking for that harmonious blend through all products. The cinnamon tends to come up more. The spiciness gets mellowed a little bit. The richness in the molasses comes out a little bit more. And what you're looking at then is a really nice, well-balanced, spicy rye whiskey that still has a really great, rich backbone. This would be the first whiskey that we released in our most award-winning to date. Does anyone pick up any notes in that whiskey? Honey, perfect. Does anyone pick up the mintiness? Rye whiskey is very known for its mintiness, and some people get it, some people don't. Everyone's a little bit different in sensory. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. Typically, this Rendezvous Rye will come across with that very big, botanical eucalyptus mintiness, almost kind of gin botanical-like that rye is really known for. On to the Blue Rye. Anyone taste the Blue Rye at our booth out there? All right. The Blue Rye is where we're going with our blending program, which is a blend of some very different whiskeys. They typically don't see each other in a blend, which is a bourbon and a rye. You have a bourbon mash bill, a grain bill. You have corn, malted barley, and you have rye in most bourbons. In this particular blend, we've taken an already matured and aged bourbon and an already matured and aged rye and blended those together at different concentrations. So you have that nice bourbon backbone with some great dry rye spice up front as well. That is going to be your number 4 glass.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're 37, 39 years old. Where did the 16-year-old rye come from?
We have 2 different arms to our business. A lot of times when whiskey companies start, they bring in outsourced products from other distilleries. Sitting on a product for 6 years, 8 years until you get something nice to the market, it's very, very expensive. Basically just burying money in a barrel and putting it away, just hope that you're going to make it to that year 4, year 6, or 8, or whatever it might be. So with all our aged whiskeys right now, we outsource these whiskeys. We bring them in as different base components from other distilleries, and we do our own blends under our label. We're making whiskeys now, and have been making whiskeys now for 3+ years and putting those away in barrels. And we're probably about a year, year and a half away from bringing in our own blends into our existing blends. And then as time goes on, you work more and more and more in, and you have a sustainable distillery.
Cool.
We have a 21-year-old as well.
Right. I know
The 21-year-old was, we just got lucky finding that one basically. To find a 21-year-old rye whiskey now is weird.
pretty incredible too. You gonna tell us about the jackalope?
Pardon?
You gonna tell us about the jackalope?
I can tell you the jackalope, yeah, absolutely. The jackalope is, does everyone know the history of the jackalope? It's kind of a myth. Antelope famers? Or excuse me, the rabbit famers? No, this is part of that. The jackalope is what the cowboys in the western United States used to hear when they're sitting around the campfire. And they have a penny for whiskey. Jackalopes love whiskey. So the cowboys are sitting around the fire and they'll hear voices out in the forest. I say, did you hear that? I say, oh, yeah, that sound, that nice. Did you hear that? And the jackalopes say, hey, over here. They'll mimic voices of the cowboys to direct their attention away from the whiskey and away from the fire so they can steal the whiskey. So since the jackalope's a great blend of 2 animals, we named a great blend of great whiskey as well. So, is everyone picking up the rye and bourbon in the Son of Blue Rye? How do we like that? Well, we were promising some people, and I don't even have a slide about this one. I'll talk about Campfire here in a second. I don't even have a slide about the APR. We have a whiskey here tonight that we did not have at our booth. It is the APR. It's the American Prairie Reserve Bourbon. And that is on your top left at your place C. And this is a blend of straight bourbons. It's our first blend of straight bourbons released. We typically focus on rye. Yeah.
So when you say 30 years worth of
it just depends on the whiskey. I mean, the age obviously is the component which will tell you how long you've been there. But you can age bourbons and rye as long as you want, or any kind of Scotch whiskey as long as you want. So. If it's just the 2 exact same whiskeys and just the only thing different is age, then yeah, age is the yes, yeah, if they're 2 different ages, and it's really just the age on this product. This is a blend of a UP for this specific product on the APR. The bourbons are slightly different. But what we have in here is we have a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old bourbon. Other than that, the whiskeys are very, very similar. So what you have is you have kind of a good mid-range, 6 to 7 years is a good mid-range for a bourbon. That tends to be a pretty good balance at that age. And then you have a 10-year-old whiskey. A lot more richness and depth coming out of a 10-year-old whiskey to help with that backbone. So the 6 years is the primary component, and the 10 years is the money. But yeah, good question. And that one, there are 2 different straight bourbons.
How much maceration?
There's a bit of batch-to-batch variation, and hence the blending. The biggest probably batch-to-batch variation is the barrels aging. The barrels come out a little bit different. It's just like you're not going to have two exact same trees where the barrels come from. You're not going to have two really exact same whiskeys from the barrels. You can round out that difference a little bit better on new make spirit if you have all your process value you might like to, but there is some batch-to-batch variation. It's something you just can't get away from, to be honest. So now on to the campfire here that we have up on the screen. The campfire is one of our newest blends. The APR is the newest, the campfire is the second newest. That's on the top, the last one, top right. And this is a blend of 3 different styles of whiskey: bourbon, rye, and scotch. So for the real geeked out whiskey connoisseur, this is something kind of nice and unique to taste. It's a peated scotch, so you have that smoke kind of come through in the finish. But up front, you do get that rye spice with that nice, rich, chewy bourbon backbone, and that wonderful, if you like peated scotches, that wonderful smoky finish really just ties it all together. It's a whiskey that has many, many, many layers. What do you think of the campfire?
Kick ass. Well,
yeah, all right.
good.
Yeah, that was really fun to put together. I don't think Scotland really likes us for it. They're pretty protective of their brands, and so we get a little bit of crap from them, that's for sure. But
My favorite one.
is this your favorite one?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, right on. I'm getting the nod that it's about time to go here, so I'm going to wrap it up. Are there any questions? We got some time for some questions.
What was the second one on the right side?
The second one on the right side was the Son of Blue Rye.
Okay,
That,
so I taste the APR instead. That's the second one.
is the Jack with the Son of Blue
I just
Rye.
have one that's blue rye.
Pardon?
We have one that's just called blue rye.
We did, yeah. The Blue Rye was the first generation. The Son of Blue Rye had to come up because we ran out of one of the key bourbons in the Blue Rye blend. So that was a limited production product, and we were forced to move on to the next generation, the Son of Blue Rye. Who knows what the next name will be? We'll come up with something. But the Son of Blue Rye will be around for a little while. We have more stock of the bourbons in the Son of Blue Rye.
Thank you, Brendan.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.
We use 52-gallon and 40-gallon barrels in our process. All the barrels that we use are white American oak. There's a rule in America: to be a rye whiskey or to be a bourbon, you need to be white American oak, fresh charred new wood. And that's the definition, the legal definition that gets tied into being a bourbon and being a rye. And that's kind of an age-old rule that's kind of hung around for a couple reasons. Number one, it was back in the day when it was meant to uphold the integrity of the product. Bourbon had a flavor profile, and they went to the bourbon makers and they said, well, what makes bourbon bourbon? And they said, well, aging in new oak is a really, really important part of being bourbon. So they said, okay, it has to be new oak, and it has to be freshly charred. The other thing it did is it ensured the jobs and the lives of the coopers of America. That was a big one too. Pardon? It has to be an American, white American. It has to be white American to make bourbon. You can use those other ways, some French oaks, yeah. And we do some experimentation blending and our barreling with some wine barrels and some toasted oaks. But yeah, it's a legal definition to put that name on there. I don't have it with me, but the 21-year-old is actually aged in used barrels. It's not new barrels, so we can't say rye whiskey on there. We have to say a whiskey distilled from rye mash. It's just one of those little wording things that we have to do. That's the federal government. That was the double rye. That was the 2-year-old and the 16-year-old. So the real spicy rye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Appreciate it, Brendan.
Thanks for coming.